Part 1, January 1976. Chapter 1. On those cloudy days, Robert Neville was never sure when sunset came, and sometimes they were in the streets before he could get back. If he had been more analytical, he might have calculated the approximate time of their arrival, but he still used the lifetime habit of judging nightfall by the sky, and on cloudy days that method didn't work. That was why he chose to stay near the house on those days. He walked around the house in the dull gray of afternoon, a cigarette dangling from the corner of his mouth, trailing thread-like smoke over his shoulder. He checked each window to see if any of the boards had been loosened. After violent attacks, the planks were often split or partially pried off, and he had to replace them completely, a job he hated. Today, only one plank was loose. Isn't that amazing? He thought. In the backyard, he checked the hothouse and the water tank. Sometimes the structure around the tank might be weakened, or its rain catchers bent or broken off. Sometimes they would lob rocks over the high fence around the hothouse, and occasionally they would tear through the overhead net, and he'd have to replace the panes. Both the tank and the hothouse were undamaged today. He went to the house for a hammer and nails. As he pushed open the front door, he looked at the distorted reflection of himself in the cracked mirror he'd fastened to the door a month ago. In a few days, jagged pieces of the silver-backed glass would start to fall off. Let 'em fall, he thought. It was the last damn mirror he'd put there. It wasn't worth it. He'd put garlic there instead. Garlic always worked. He passed slowly through a dim silence of the living room, turned left into the small hallway, and left again into his bedroom. Once the room had been warmly decorated, but that was in another time. Now it was a room entirely functional, and since Neville's bed and bureau took up so little space, he had converted one side of the room into a shop. A long bench covered almost an entire wall. On its hardwood top, a heavy bandsaw, a wood lathe, an emery wheel, and a vise. Above it, on the wall, were haphazard racks of the tools that Robert Neville used. He took a hammer from the bench and picked out a few nails from one of the distorted bins. Then he went back outside and nailed the plank fast to the shutter. The unused nails he threw into the rubble next door. For a while he stood on the front lawn, looking up and down the silent length of Cimarron Street. He was a tall man, 36, born of English-German stock, his features undistinguished, except for the long, determined mouth and the bright blue of his eyes, which moved now over the charred ruins of the houses on each side of his. He'd burned them down to prevent them from jumping on his roof from the adjacent ones. After a few minutes, he took a long, slow breath and went back into the house. He tossed the hammer on the living room couch, then lit another cigarette and had his mid-morning drink. Later, he forced himself into the kitchen to grind up the 5-day accumulation of garbage in the sink. He knew he should burn up the paper plates and utensils too, and dust the furniture, and wash out the sinks, and the bathtub, and toilet, and change the sheets and pillowcase on his bed. But he didn't feel like it. For he was a man, and he was alone, and these things had no importance to him. It was almost noon. Robert Neville was in his hothouse, collecting a basket full of garlic. In the beginning, it had made him sick to smell garlic in such quantity. His stomach had been in a state of constant turmoil. Now the smell was in his hothouse, and in his clothes, and sometimes he thought it was even in his flesh. He hardly noticed it at all. When he had enough bulbs, he went back to the house and dumped them on the drain board of the sink. As he flicked the wall switch, the light flickered, then flared into normal brilliance. A disgusted hiss passed his clenched teeth. The generator was at it again. He'd have to get out that damn manual again and check the wiring. And if it were too much trouble to repair, he'd have to install a new generator. Angrily, he jerked a high-legged stool to the sink, got a knife, and sat down with an exhausted grunt. First, he separated the bulbs into the small sickle-shaped cloves. Then, he cut each pink leathery clove in half, exposing the fleshy center buds. The air thickened with a musky, pungent odor. When it got too oppressive, he snapped on the air conditioning unit and suction drew away the worst of it. Now, he reached over and took an ice pick from its wall rack. He punched holes in each clove half, then strung them all together with wire until he had about 25 necklaces. In the beginning, he had hung these necklaces over the windows, but from a distance they'd throw rocks until he'd been forced to cover the broken panes with plywood scraps. Finally, one day he'd torn off the plywood and nailed up even rows of planks instead. It had made the house a gloomy sepulchre, but it was better than having rocks come flying into his rooms in a shower of splintered glass. And once he had installed the 3 air conditioning units, it wasn't too bad. A man could get used to anything if he had to. When he was finished stringing the garlic cloves, he went outside and nailed them over the window boarding, taking down the old strings, which had lost most of their potent smell. He had to go through this process twice a week, until he found something better. It was his first line of defense. Defense? He often thought. For what? All afternoon he made steaks. He laid them out of thick doweling, bandsawed into 9-inch lengths. These be held against the whirling emery stone until they were as sharp as daggers. It was tiresome, monotonous work, and it filled the air with hot-smelling wood dust that settled in his pores and got into his lungs and made him cough. Yet he never seemed to get ahead. No matter how many steaks he made, they were gone in no time at all. Doweling was getting harder to find, too. Eventually, he'd have to lay down rectangular lengths of wood. Won't that be fun, he thought, irritably. It was all very depressing, and it made him resolve to find a better method of disposal. But how could he find it when they never gave him a chance to slow down and think? As he lathed, he listened to records over the loudspeaker he'd set up in his bedroom. Beethoven's 3rd, 7th, and 9th symphonies. He was glad he'd learned early in life from his mother to appreciate this kind of music. It helped him to fill the terrible void of hours. From 4 o'clock on, his gaze kept shifting to the clock on the wall. He worked in silence, lips pressed into a hard line, a cigarette in the corner of his mouth, his eyes staring at the bit as it gnawed away the wood and sent floury dust filtering down to the floor. 4:15, 4:30, it was 4:45. In another hour they'd be at the house again. The filthy bastards. As soon as the light was gone, he stood before the giant freezer, selecting his supper. His jaded eyes moved over the stacks of meats, down to the frozen vegetables, down to the breads and pastries, the fruits and ice cream. He picked out 2 lamb chops, string beans, and a small box of orange sherbet. He picked the boxes from the freezer and pushed shut the door with his elbow. Next, he moved over the uneven stacks of cans piled to the ceiling. He took down a can of tomato juice, then left the room that had once belonged to Kathy, and now belonged to his stomach. He moved slowly across the living room, looking at the mural that covered the back wall. It showed a cliff edge, shearing off to green-blue ocean that surged and broke over black rocks. Far up in the clear blue sky, white seagulls floated on the wind, and over on the right gnarled tree hung over the precipice, its dark branches etched against the sky.